also want our mature oaks to provide food for people and wildlife in the future. And we also need to replace many of the oaks that we have lost or we are currently losing due to pests or climate change or fires. And I think this gets into the conflict of what we want. All of these things are relatively far down the line. We want mature trees. We want to replace these trees and plant these trees. So in 10, 20, 50 years, we'll have a really great oak grove. Wildlife has needs right now, right today. If it hasn't been a good crop this year for acorns, then they're going to be trying to collect every single last acorn out there. And we might not have a lot of seedlings coming out up that year. Or for example, drought. Drought just comes and goes. It doesn't really care. And so here's the current in the upper right, the current drought monitor for the state of California, and the entire state is in drought. Luckily, San Diego County is in the most minor of the drought conditions, but as it keeps getting hotter and drier, the dark reds and the yellows will start to expand. I do want to highlight again what we talked about, or so what the speakers talked about yesterday, about when these problems started happening with oaks. And as far as we can tell, oaks were not under any sort of threat before the colonization of California. The Native Americans were doing a very good job of managing oaks for food, and acorns constituted a very large part of the diet. In some cases, acorns constituted up to 50% of calories for the year, which is absolutely amazing. Think that, imagine if you're having 2 meals a day, one of that is consisting of nearly all acorns as the source of your diet. Or if you're 2 meals a day, half of your bowl consists of some sort of acorn food, which is pretty amazing considering our current diet now. We can have all sorts of pastas and chips and corn, but just to think that one single source of plant constituted, anywhere from 20 to 50% of the diet is really amazing. And these groves were, they were well managed and frequently managed, as we learned yesterday, by Native American tribes. I mean, this was the stable source of food for many tribes. And so you would do the best job you can managing that. And they historically did a really, really good job. So then the question of when things became problems was basically when the Europeans arrived and started to bring weeds from other continents. Livestock were introduced to Southern California, cows and horses, sheep and others as well. They disrupted the fire regime and in some cases, completely dismantled it for, nearly a century. And they also used oak wood for new and intensive purposes, like large buildings or mining or ranching, where traditionally oak was not necessarily used as logs and things like that. But when the Spaniards arrived with metal tools, it was a lot easier to chop down oak trees and use them in these things. So an oak forest became, instead of a grocery store historically, or the equivalent of a grocery store, it became wood and something that you would need to chop down to then use to build a large building or whatever, or burn it in smelting for mines. And this is to say that we haven't stopped disrupting oak woodlands in Southern Californians. We still have a disrupted fire regime. We're still getting new pests and diseases, as Stacy and Charlie mentioned yesterday morning. We're still getting new weeds into Southern California, and we're still diverting water away from creeks, rivers, and streams, and are still harming oaks. So it's not that any of this isn't necessarily new in the span of our lifetime, but it's new in the span of just a couple hundred years that we've really changed the ecology of oak woodlands in Southern California. And I do want to make a caveat, because restoring oak areas is a little bit different than some of your other restoration projects, because these are large, slow-growing trees. And if you successfully plant, let's say 20 of them, you can have an oak grove over an acre or half an acre or so. So you really need to think long-term about what you're doing when you're starting a restoration project. And so you might need to consult your tribal environmental department, tribal council, tribal elders, and other neighbors in your community who are interested in plants, especially oaks, and any others who are knowledgeable about restoration or oaks, because you are taking on a very long-term project when you're putting an oak tree in the ground. So it's something that hopefully our grandchildren will be able to see in the world, which I think is kind of highlights the responsibility that we have. So the rest of my talk is going to be broken up into these kind of what to do if scenarios. And so I'll ask kind of a hypothetical or, mostly real world questions of what to do if, and I'll provide the answer. So the first one, what to do if everything wants to kill your oaks. The world, you've tried to plant some seedlings or do whatever, and it's a lot. So the first and usually most cheapest way to solve this problem is to overplant. So there's two kind of basic ways to do this. You can plant more acorns per hole. So here we have 3 seedlings in a planting basin. And of these 3 seedlings, one of them has died with the red tombstone, and 2 of them are still surviving. Hopefully in the next couple of years, one of these 2 will survive, and I will have been 100% successful in planting 1 seedling in this planting basin. The other way to do this is just to plant more holes or plant at more sites than you need. So for example, like if your site could use 100 mature trees, and you think you're going to have a relatively moderate or lower amount of herbivory, then you might be planting 125 seedlings to get your 100 trees, assuming you have about a 75% mortality, 75% survival, 25% mortality, sorry. Or maybe 150 if you think you might be a little less successful. But if herbivory is really, really high and you think you might lose half of your seedlings, then you might need to plant 200 seedlings instead of the 100 to get your 100 mature trees. And this method is relatively cheap and easy, but it of course assumes that digging your planting holes is easy and cheap. And that totally depends on labor and your soil and your location. If you're having to hike into your planting site a mile and you're digging in some really rocky soils, then yeah, this is not going to be cheap and easy. And it comes with one huge risk, is that if too many of your seedlings survive, that you might have to reduce the population. And so if you are not willing to kind of cull those extra seedlings, then this method is definitely not for you, because you don't want to have too many oak trees growing in too close of a cluster. They won't grow very properly. So what do you do if a drought comes your way? And hint, hint, we're in the middle of a relatively large drought, or at least the beginnings of a relatively large drought. So the first thing and the easiest thing to do is to delay your project to plant it in a different year. I can't tell you the number of projects that I had from 2012 to 2016 that were absolute failures because I was trying to do restorations in a drought. So if you can, try and delay the project and pray for rain the next year. And one of the ways this is works pretty well is that most of the time you're putting out your acorns in the field January, February, maybe even March, or your seedlings in the field January, February, March. And as Dan Cayenne showed us earlier this morning, by that time we should have started to receive some rain. So if we haven't received a lot of rain, then there's a good chance that we're going to be in a drought year by the time January or February rolls around. So if we haven't had a lot of good rain by January or February, there's a good chance that your oak seedlings probably aren't going to make it very well anyways. But if you still want to go ahead, then you can irrigate. There's 2 easy ways to irrigate. One is to bring in water into the site, tanks and hoses. All kind of makes sense. And I've got a couple of different pictures here of portable tank and something you can put in the back of your pickup truck. And then the other thing to do is to concentrate natural water by creating berms and basins. So the goal of this is basically to use the area around the oak seedling to concentrate the water so that it grows right near the base of the roots there. And it's relatively easy to do. So assuming you have a little slope on your site, on the uphill part of the slope, you're going to dig out this portion here, this kind of lens of dirt, and you're going to remove it all. And on the downhill portion of the site, you're going to fill it in and make a berm. So you've then made this, a couple foot wide, flat planting area that will collect all of the extra water from upslope. So if you're looking at this from above, it looks like this big, giant U-shaped hill with a seedling in the middle, and the arms of the U-shape should be somewhat wide so it catches all of the water and concentrates it into the bottom of the basin. And here's a kind of side view picture of what that looks like as well over here on the left. So what do you do if the site has a lot of hungry herbivores? And the best thing to do is that you will need to protect them with some sort of tree tube or tree shelter until that they're large enough to survive. And it takes usually about 2 or 3 years. I will also mention that if you have cows around, then when you put out your tree tubes or tree shelters, you're going to want to use a really sturdy post on the inside of your tree tube, like a T-post, and usually like a 4 to 6 foot T-post, because cows tend to be really, really itchy. And so once you start putting a post in the middle of a rangeland, the cows get all excited about it and will start scratching their backs, and a 1,500-pound animal versus a little flimsy rebar will just get bent right over. But these tree tubes are really good at helping these oaks survive being eaten by relatively moderately sized herbivores. So things like rabbits and deer, but also cows as well. And they allow, after a couple of years, the oak will pop out of the tube at the top. And by that time, the oak seedlings are pretty well established. If your herbivores are eating your seedlings from underground, then you can build a cage that goes down into the soil to keep things like gophers from eating the tender young shoots. So here's kind of 2 examples. On the left, here's a kind of more of a plastic tube, and on the right is a wire cage. And if you were looking for gopher control, you'd put this wire cage in the ground at least about 6 inches, maybe even a little deeper. The issue, of course, is that if you go deep, you have to remove that cage after a while. So you're going to want to go with a wider cage so you don't disturb the roots. So if you need to plant a cage that's, let's say, 1 foot deep, you're going to want to plant it 3, maybe even 4 feet wide around your oak seedling. So when you pull that cage out of the ground in 2 years, you're not going to disturb the oak taproot that's growing down. Like I mentioned, you need to leave them on for about 2 years, but don't forget to take these things off. There's a great picture on the left of a tree that has some sort of a protection around it that's obviously been on for, I don't know, let's call it 50 years too long. So do make sure that you get out there and remove your tree protection once the trees have established and they're safe. So what do you do if there's just a lot of kind of generally small, hungry critters nearby? So maybe things like rats or other kind of herbivores like that. The best IPM practice you can do for that is to encourage predators. And that's, of course, assuming you can. So a really great idea is to put in a barn owl box, excuse me. And so here on the right is a barn owl box. Here's kind of the schematic diagram for a barn owl box. Also, kestrel boxes will work really well, so because kestrels can eat small animals that might be preying upon your oak seedlings, or as well as artificial perches to attract larger raptors. And I'm sure Kurt knows what that bird is, but to me, it's just some sort of big red hawk. And there's a ton of books and free resources out there from bird conservation organizations. My department, A&R, has this book, the Songbird, Bat, and Owl Boxes, which has blueprints and diagrams and all sorts of stuff in it. So there's plenty of resources out there for you to help kind of build these natural predator type habitats. If you have a lot of, what to do if you have a lot of weeds near your seedlings or your restoration site is full of weeds? Well, we do know that oak seedling survival can be low when weeds are nearby. And especially if you have a drought and you have a lot of weeds, then your oak seedling survival can go all the way down to 0. So your entire project can be lost just due to lack of water and just enough water for all the weeds to thrive around the oak seedling. There's plenty of ways to clear the weeds. You can hoe them out, you can spray them out, you can do all sorts of mulches, but you do need to make sure that you clear the weeds around your oak seedlings because those weeds are really, really aggressive. And on top of that, they can also carry fire. And so the most vulnerable stage of an oak's life cycle for dying in fire is when they are seedlings. So you're going to want to make sure that there's a relatively large area around your oak seedlings that it's weed free, which then is also fuel free. What do you do if there's a lot of weeds near your seedlings? Oh, this is the mulch picture. So you're going to want to mulch around your oak seedlings. Wooden mulch is best, and you want to get it from healthy trees. So if you're getting it, and it can be regular wooden mulch or it can be composted wooden mulch, doesn't necessarily matter so much. And you want to make sure also to include some oak leaf litter in your mulch as well. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Your mulch should be about 4 to 6 inches deep and about anywhere from 3 to kind of 6 feet wide. And at that 4 to 6 inches deep, it'll last about a year, maybe 2 years, depending on rainfall, depending on what type of slope you're working on and how much kind of rocks are on the site versus plants and soft soil to kind of help the mulch stick to the soil surface. So it's something that'll work. You might need to replace it after a year or so, depending on what type of site you're at, but it is a nice, easy way to do it as long as it's coming from healthy trees. So what do you do if you have people who are wandering around your site and might damage your site, even if they're unknowingly damaging your site, like if you have a campground nearby or hiking trails or things like that, or just, people wandering because they're curious and want to be outdoors. So the first thing that, because I am in extension, the first thing I like to think of is to try and engage these people because they're already walking around your site. So maybe they are your allies in helping you to restore these sites. So try and provide volunteer opportunities for your community or educational events. So that way people are not unknowingly damaging your site, but then become ambassadors and allies in the effort to try and restore these sites. And if you can't do any of that, then the least best, but still an option, is to put out some signage, either some sort of habitat restoration sign, if you want to go the very authoritarian way, some sort of keep out signs. I like the take only pictures, leave only footprints, which may or may not be as effective. I have no idea. I'm not a social scientist. So the last thing I do want to point out is that oaks like to be growing in oak mulch. And I think Charlie talked about this pretty well on the first day yesterday, that oak seedlings survive best when they're inoculated with oak microbes and the fungi that's growing in the soil. So what you want to do is when you're planting your seedlings or your acorns, to gather some oak leaf litter from underneath a healthy oak tree and place it around your planting hole. You can take some soil too to make sure you get some of those soil microbes, but you do want to make sure that you're not moving the soil too far, and that will help to discourage you from spreading weed seeds that are in the soil. And you want to also make sure that you're doing it from nearby, that your oak trees that are nearby are healthy. So you're collecting healthy soil in there, so you've got the good microbes rather than a lot of the really cool fungi that Charlie showed us yesterday that unfortunately kill the oak, but they look really cool. And with that, I'm just about out of time. So if there's any questions or comments, I'll take them now, but here's my email address, cjmcdonald@ucanr.edu. So yeah, thank you so much.
There were a couple of questions, Chris, but I'm going to hold those until the Q&A session. I have them written down, if you don't mind. And
no, like I said, I had to like squeeze in a whole bunch of stuff really, really tight. So I tried to talk as fast as I could while still
you did
getting
a great job.
Educated.
You did a fantastic job, and we'll have more time, I think, during the discussion. So let's get through the presentations. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker. Is going to be Dan Glewsonkamp. Dan, if you want to start sharing your screen while I introduce you. Dan is the executive director for the California Institute for Biodiversity. Past work, he was the executive director of the California Native Plant Society, and he was the director of habitat protection and restoration for Audubon Canyon Ranch's 31 preserves. Dan has a PhD from UC Berkeley, and he's well known for having rediscovered the presumed extinct Franciscan manzanita. And while he joins us from Northern California, he was born and raised in Fallbrook. And Dan is going to be talking to us about re-oaking California. For thousands of years, oaks have nurtured and housed California's diverse communities. With the arrival of Europeans in recent centuries, oaks have been removed from California. And as the state begins investing billions in carbon sequestration, fire management, climate resilience, urban heat risk mitigation, and biodiversity protection, restoring and protecting oaks is more important than ever, and the future for oaks brighter than it's been for a long time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan, and while he's talking, feel free to put questions in the chat, and I will keep track of them, and we'll get to them hopefully soon. So go ahead, Dan.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you, Carolyn. With that intro and the abstract, I feel like you gave my talk for me. So first I wanted to start with some thanks and some gratitude. And I know this has been done already, but I just want to thank Kurt and Carolyn and Chris for putting this together. So hopefully everyone can give them a hand. Thanks, this has been an awesome couple days. And then of course, I want to do a land recognition and give thanks and acknowledgement that I'm right now on the ancestral homeland of the Yelamu tribe of the Ramaytush Ohlone, the original people of the San Francisco Peninsula, and especially San Francisco. To me, it's really very cool to be speaking to an event organized and hosted by the Pala Band. That's kind of the tribe that I grew up with. I grew up in Fallbrook, and I have great love for Pala. And my dad was the town doctor, and I still remember how Mrs. Guachino would come in with, you know, like a dozen kids and park them in the office, and they had to be absolutely silent while my dad did the annual checkups on each kid. And it feel very good being invited to be a part of something that Pala is doing. So thank you very much. Okay, so and this is, you know, these are our neighborhood mortars. This is at Live Oak Park in Fallbrook, where I grew up, and very much tuned to oaks. This was a refuge for us where we could get in out of the shade and really reconnect with kind of deep history and understanding, you know, a kind of meaning that you don't get from the television. And this is, you know, Snack Shack across the street from Live Oak Park that used to be just a couple of years ago was a nice oak forest, and they've cleared it to put in some citrus. And so, you know, we've done wrong by oaks for a while. Oaks have sustained humans in California for 1,000 generations and sustained ecosystems and fed animals and sequestered carbon and all of that kind of stuff. And in recent decades, we've come in and we've kind of reversed that, and we've started taking them out so that they're no longer sustaining the community in the way that they can. And we've actually taken that to such an extreme that we're realizing that we have removed far too many oaks and we're in trouble, and we need to start restoring them. We need to start bringing those oaks back for every possible reason. Not just for the obvious biodiversity reasons, not just to sequester carbon and give people and animals heat refuge, but really, you know, I really feel like oak restoration, more than anything else, is an act of decolonization, rolling back the clock on some really stupid things that people have done in California in recent decades. and starting to build a new future. And so I love reoak. And in this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of where I first learned of the concept of reoak, or maybe the term of reoak. So some history on it, talk a little bit about a project that I started at the California Native Plant Society, and then finish up by talking about kind of my vision, my hopes for reoak in California. And I first heard the term reoak, of course, from Robin Grossinger, brilliant scientist, great sociologist, and fantastic at coming up with names. And we were hanging out at the SurCal meeting in Oakland in like 2012, and he said, "We need to reoak Oakland," and I said, "Sign me up." So it took him a few years, but Robin Grossinger and the San Francisco Estuary Institute kind of turned that term into a plan, and they got funded to put together a plan for, as you can see here, reoaking Silicon Valley. And this is a number of years old, and it's just been continuing. It's caught a lot of imagination in Silicon Valley, and there's real efforts to reoak Silicon Valley. Very interesting stuff. Along the way, others have jumped on board and got excited to reoak within their area, within their watersheds or their districts. And so in particular, Napa RCD started an Acorns to Oaks project that they renamed a reoak project that made great strides in connecting with the community and bringing them in to restore oaks to the landscape. And I think that's an important part of reoak, is that it really involves communities. It needs to be done at scale with the kind of resources that governments can bring, but it fundamentally is a thing that people can do, people do. Reoak Napa and others converged into reoak North Bay. And this especially took off after the great fires that swept through wine country in the North Bay. And it was at that point, that in 2017 was, at that point, the largest fire we'd ever had in California. And it coincided, and so in that fire, it really took out incredible amounts of really beautiful oak landscape. Some oaks, but many of them actually, as you well know, needed that fire. And so it wasn't necessarily terrible for the oaks, except in areas where they cut them down for fuel breaks and that kind of stuff. But it also coincided with a mast year, the likes of which no one has ever seen. Incredible numbers of acorns hitting the ground. And so we scrambled to put those acorns to use and to seize the opportunity of reoaking areas from which oaks had been removed over decades in the wake of the fire, and bring the community in on it. Not just to save oaks and fix some of the damage that had been done by the fire and by the bulldozers post-fire, but also just to kind of give people some hope. And so with a generous donation by a super brilliant donor who saw the opportunity to do something really big, the Native Plant Society was able to pull together a reoak wine country, was what we called it. And so here's a little San Francisco Chronicle story on it. And we got a lot of media on this. It was very exciting at a time that things were so doom and gloom in the aftermath of the Great Fire. This was some good news. And it really helped for us to get that, because our reoak project was a little bit different. It learned from previous ones, and it applied those lessons within a very different framework. And so I want to talk a bit about that project, because I think some of the principles that we applied and some of the lessons that we learned, I think, are incredibly valuable. And so the basic idea is that you collect acorns, you plant acorns, you wait a few hundred years, and you have oak trees. That's the basic idea for reoak. With the one that we did at the California Native Plant Society, we had some basic principles. We asked people to go out into their neighborhoods or into sites that they had access to, legal access, and collect acorns using a very, very strict protocol. We gave them science-based protocols for acorn collection. And in addition, we gave them data sheets to complete so that we knew the location, the species, other conditions. So it was really scientific data collection. We also asked them to clip a branch off the oak tree and send that to us so that we could identify the oak definitively. And then we asked them to mail those to the CNPS headquarters, and we got inundated. First, from wine country, we received something like 1,000 boxes. We're talking about these kind of 5-pound FedEx boxes. People would go out and they collect 5 or 10 or 30 pounds of acorns and mail them to the office with these data sheets and the vegetation sample, and we would process them. And over time, more people got involved and started saying, we need to re-oak, I live in the Sierra foothills and we need to re-oak my watershed as well. And so we expanded it to re-oak California. And the basic principles were that we wanted to know, we were doing this as restoration at scale, maintaining local genetics on the scale of all of California. So we would track where acorns came from, and over the course of it, we would make sure that those acorns or the seedlings that we grew with them went back to those same locations, so that we weren't mixing up the beautiful population genetic structure that these plants have created over thousands and millions of years. And it's really challenging. We talk about local natives and rebuilding no one understands better than California tribes how every location is different, and the brothers and sisters creatures that live there are different from the ones in Northern California or somewhere else. And so it's very important for us to maintain that local, and we actually did it at scale. In the course of it, so here's some examples of people mailing in just a few acorns in envelopes, or rather, these are samples that we kept. I'm sorry. And about 28,000 of them wound up being grown by Ryan West in Carlsbad, and those we transplanted out manually. The best way to plant oaks is, of course, plant seeds, but we also planted a lot of seedlings, and we would distribute these around California using our re-oak van to get 28,000, I believe, oak plants out across California. And we succeeded. We got those out, we engaged with communities, we connected with schools, we got hundreds or thousands of Californians involved. Certainly 1,000 involved in collecting, which is incredible. And we got those oaks back out to their watersheds so that they could be planted in a site that might have been cleared decades ago, but has been needing oak trees ever since. And it was a great success. And so let me see how much time I have here. Okay, so I'm gonna,
just keep going, Dan, you're fine, I'll let you know.
Okay, cool, okay. And so I think that's really important to note. There were a few big lessons out of the re-oak project that I think can inform all of us. And let me scroll down to my notes here. I've been extemporaneizing, but I want to make sure that I catch these because it's very important. So, well, first I want to say, I do want to make the point that restoration is slow. It's slower, more expensive, more fraught, and much less important than saving oaks in the first place. First thing that we need to do is we need to save seedlings, saplings, young trees, old trees, landscapes. We need to save oaks. It's a lot easier than restoring them. And that can simply amount to making sure that, folks who, landlords who might have their landscape gardened or something can tell their gardeners not to cut down those saplings. And having lived in Sacramento for 8 long years, there's an incredible number of beautiful oaks popping up from the soil there that get chopped down. And if we could simply stop killing them, California would re-oak itself. So that's an important one. But I also want to point out to, for those of us who actually want to engage in reintroducing oaks to landscapes, we need it to be a big, large-scale, well-structured, well-funded operation. And that may be the case. This year's budget has, I think we're proposing something like $400 million for tree planting, largely for urban heat islands and climate risk amelioration. But we're starting to think about re-oak at the level of a society. That's important, but we really don't need to wait. Re-oaking is something that all of us can do. It's easy. All of our ancestors have been planting acorns or things like acorns for thousands of years. And these trees have a will to live. Many of them will die. You can ameliorate some of that mortality using techniques like what Chris talked about. But fundamentally, if we all get out there and start re-oaking, we don't have to wait for for government to come out and give us a cookbook or the funding for it. We can do a lot now. And so general principles on that are obviously start now. We need to re-oak, not plant areas at which oaks have never occurred. Because in that we have, we can have significant impacts on biodiversity by, planting in a beautiful wildflower grassland that might have been maintained as a grassland for thousands of years. And now we turn it into an oak forest. That's not what we want to do. But there's, as you can see in this photo, California has plenty of areas that were covered with oaks have been removed. Anyone who drives along Highway 101 will pass literally millions of acres of beautiful oak landscape that is devoid of oaks. So we have a lot of opportunities for re-oaking at whatever scale we care to do. Another really important principle that I want to put out there is to be conservative and trust that over the millions of years that these trees have been living in California, they've learned lessons and they've evolved wisdom and they've earned the right to be trusted. And that means, to me, that means keep it local. Keep our hubris to a minimum. Don't think that we can predict the future climate scenarios and engineer an oak that's going to be perfect for the climate of the future. Instead, trust that these organisms that live for hundreds of years, organisms for whom climate is weather, that survive a dry century and say, oh, I'm so glad it's getting moist now. Trust that they have some local wisdom and a connection to the place that they live in that is smarter than we are. And so in that, we keep it local. You collect acorns locally and you plant them locally. You don't mix populations. If you're going to start a new population, start it with a single source so that it is imitating nature, that it imitates the way oaks have always been re-oaked, whether it's by jaybirds or by humans or by restorationists in the 20th and 21st century. I think back to, an earlier talk here. I think it was Yuvia talking about Engelman Oaks. There are Engelman Oaks or things that look a lot like them far up in Northern California. In Vasco Caves near the San Francisco Bay, there's an oak tree on top of a hill that apparently everyone is sure is an Engelman Oak. There's another one uphill from Sacramento in the Sierra foothills that I didn't believe until I saw a photo, and it looks like an Engelman Oak. And it makes sense because there were humans walking around carrying these oaks for thousands of years. And so we need to trust that that these things have a wisdom that when we start new populations, we start them the way they've always been started, and not with a mix with hybrids. And then of course, I think the most important principle is to connect with people, do this work as a community, share the joy of it, and communicate, share the story about how we're able to actually make a difference, make a positive difference in these places that is enduring, that will sequester tens of thousands of pounds of carbon, and will give trees for kids to play under, and will be here long past us, that more than just are good for climate change and biodiversity, are fundamentally a long-term investment in food security for all of us, and really are just a statement that you believe the future will be better. California has lots of oaks, lots of landscapes. If we can get California as a society moving forward on replacing the oaks that we have removed, it can change everything. So I'm happy to talk more if people want to email me. I would like to put a mention in for the California Oaks Foundation, the work that Janet Cobb and others are doing in saving oaks and saving oak landscapes. And also let those of you who are interested in doing a re-oak project at some kind of scale, let you know that there's an organization called One Tree Planted, which specializes in getting funding from corporations and then handing it out to do-gooders like us trying to plant trees. And I'd be happy to connect you with them if you're looking for funding from them. So that's my talk, and I look forward to hopefully having some time in discussion to talk about these ideas with you.
Thank you, Dan. There are a few questions, but I'm going to hold them until the chat. And if you could drop your email in the chat as well, that would be good. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker is Emma Havstad. And Emma is and go ahead, Emma, start sharing your screen while I introduce you. Emma is the restoration ecologist for River Partners in Southern California, where she focuses on large-scale horticultural restoration to deliver meaningful habitat improvements for wildlife. Since 2009, Emma has gained experience from many field jobs in the Bay Area, Oregon, Orange County, and San Diego. Her talk is going to be about planting two forests, oak riparian restoration techniques. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Emma. Go ahead, Emma.
Thank you, Carolyn. Can you guys see my slides?
Yes, you're good. We can see it.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much. And thanks for that introduction and for inviting me to share a little bit about the work that River Partners does today. just to introduce the organization a little bit, River Partners is a statewide nonprofit organization that works with communities to bring life back to the rivers of California in the West. And that includes bringing riparian oak woodlands back to communities and watersheds across the state. And when we do that, we have a sort of strategy that we internally call planting two forests. And that's kind of a phrase that I love. So I'll explain what it means in a second here.
Do you want to put your presentation on slideshow, or do you want to do it?
Oh, I thought it had. Sorry, there we go.
That's okay. I'm sorry. Now
No,
now you're there.
Appreciate it. That's great. Okay, so the big picture for this concept of planting two forests is that we are aimed at, as Carolyn kind of mentioned, doing large scale horticultural style restoration. It's aiming at doing tens to hundreds of acres at a time. So operating at a scale that's useful and meaningful for wildlife across the state. And it's a short time investment. So our goal is to get the projects in the ground and finish maintenance in year 3, which is pretty ambitious, but it's a strategy that's meant to match kind of what the state is able to fund. So we think of it as a short-term kind of capital investment rather than a long-term maintenance investment. And there's lots and lots of grants out there to do this type of work all across the state with this sort of short-term approach where we're doing as much as we can in the first 3 years, and then we've established some sort of self-sustaining forests and good wildlife habitat. And so if you're interested in hearing more about what those grant opportunities are, feel free to get in touch with me too. And so what the two forests part of this means is that when we're putting our plants in the ground in year 1, we are thinking about two sort of time frames. First is our first forest is the early successional species that go in along the floodplain. Those are the cottonwoods and the willows that are going to grow really rapidly and provide important cover and important habitat structure for the wildlife. Now, at the same time, we're planting our second forest is the slower growing oaks. So they're mixed in there, and they're at a rate of, I don't know, 3 to 5%, depending on the site location. So what's kind of missing from this time series is what the site would look like at year 40 or year 100. And so if you can imagine, some of the plants behind the gentleman in the photo are oaks, and slowly over this larger time scale, the dominant species becomes more of the slower growing oaks to form that oak woodland. There's some clear constraints on site selection where this type of work can happen efficiently and effectively, and one is water availability. So those faster growing species, the willow and the cottonwoods in our first forest, need to be able to develop roots that reach into the water table. And so there's constraints on the sites where that's possible. And it takes a lot of water during those 3 years to get the roots to develop to that state. And so our sites are under the assumption we've got an irrigation source, and we spend a lot of time thinking creatively around the state of California about where do we get water from so that we can do this and create good wildlife habitat and establish oak woodlands using the water sources that are available. The other constraint within the site about where you end up putting specific plants and where your oaks go has to do with soil structure and type. We're looking for well-drained silt or clay for putting oaks in. They don't have the constraint that they have to grow into the point where they're always touching the water table. They can grow roots other directions as well and get water that way. And so you're able to plant them in the spots where there might be great gravel layers or sand that would inhibit root development for other species. And the way you find that out along your site is by doing these soil pits and investigating. If you're doing a big site and you want to use a piece of fancy equipment, you can do a backhoe like in the picture. If not, you can also dig a hole with a shovel, find out. So what does the technique look like on the ground? So there's the field preparation phase. That's the biggest picture that you see here is clearing the field of weeds and then setting up the irrigation system. So in Southern California, we're using almost exclusively drip irrigation. And then the plants go in the ground at a density of about 200 to 300 plants per acre is what we're aiming for. You can see our friendly Conservation Corps member planting a plant in this picture. The plant protection technique that we use are these milk cartons. They biodegrade, and so you're not always needing to go back and remove those. They'll break down as the plant grows as well. And there's usually a little handful of sawdust or mulch in there to keep the weeds down inside the carton and provide a little bit of extra moisture. For oaks, we typically, rather than using container stock like you see in the picture there, we would plant them as acorns. We have had typically 70% or higher survivalship. That's getting 3 years of irrigation water will help you with that. And they typically can grow up to 4 feet in the first year. At sites in Southern California, we've had them more in getting there in 2 years. Let's see. I think that's what I had for this slide. Thanks. Oh yeah, so there's a picture of what the acorn looks like. And again, some more site photos of what maintenance requirements are. So we're doing pretty extensive weed control. Can be mechanical, can be chemical during those 3 years. And again, if you're looking at the photos on the right there, if you imagine, they're harder to see because they're slower growing, but a portion of those are the oaks that will grow over time to become dominant in the site. And another strategy that we're able to do using these kind of horticultural methods is just seeding grass species in between the rows of plants, and that helps provide some more native cover and keep the really nasty invasive weeds at a lower cover for the site. I don't think I have a photo in here of it, but we do also at times put in Raptor Perches as another method, like Chris mentioned, for attracting raptors to the site to keep the critters that are eating our plants at bay. Part of this technique is also setting up a specific layout for the site. So if you think to one of those previous pictures, each of the planting locations had a tag on it that marks what species is going where, so we can keep track of where we actually want to put the oaks. And this lets us come back later and track pretty closely how things are doing. And if we want to try different techniques, and we can kind of compare results because we have that pretty detailed system for tracking each plant in the ground at this larger scale. I don't think I mentioned it before, but we also at times use companion plants. So often we'll have an oak planted with 2 roses on each side to act as kind of a companion plant there. A couple of dryland options for working at a different scale or where you don't have water available. This picture in the center is an acorn that was put in the ground by just finding a lovely sort of wetter spot where moisture collects on the hillside, and that's a 4-year-old oak that's grown from that acorn. My friend in the picture is maybe 5'8" for reference of the size there. So that's collecting acorns. I think this is similar to kind of what Chris was describing, collecting acorns and planting. There's a system, I'm not endorsing this particular company, but I have successfully used this Groasis box system, which is the picture on the right here. So the way that works is you plant your acorn in the middle, and the plastic reservoir collects rainwater, and there's a wick that gets buried in the ground, and so it's slowly keeping the soil moist where the acorn is growing there. Alternatively, you can come and fill that, if you're not getting your rainwater as regularly as you would like. I feel like I'm missing things here. but I think I will just wait and see what questions we have. So I want to say thanks again for having me, and to all our partners that have worked with us on oak restoration across the state.
Thank you, Emma. We have a few minutes. Where are your pictures from?
Where are my pictures from?
Yeah, like the site.
They are from a variety of places. So this picture that I'm showing here is from the San Dieguito River near Escondido. And so this site was completed just last December. These are 3 or 4 year old cottonwoods, and there's a mix of smaller oaks in there that are less obvious. This picture is from San Clemente Island, and let's see, on the right here is from the San Dieguito project site again. That's a seeded grassland area within the project, and I believe the left-hand picture is from a site in Northern California. So a lot of these techniques were developed along the rivers of Central California and Central Valley, but we've been adapting them for Southern California since about 2010. We started working down here. These photos are from where the Otay River joins the bay and from the Rancho Humboldt Ecological Reserve. And I think, yeah, these ones are, the two on the right are also from the Rancho Humboldt Ecological Reserve. These are from Northern California, and this one is, yeah, you can guess from the flood irrigation that this is the Central Valley. We do have one potential project site out in Imperial with flood irrigation, but much harder to get that in Southern California than the Central Valley. And these two are along Dulzura Creek.
And one other question, since we have time for you, a question we had from the audience. What plants are good co-plantings with oaks? And they said, the person said, we have a lot of snowberry growing around ours, and I'm wondering if they are beneficial or if they suck important nutrients from the trees and should be spaced further from the trunks.
Well, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I don't know specifically about snowberry. Like I said, we do use rose as companion plants. Often those would be, I don't know, maybe two feet away from where the oak is planted on each side. So the other species that we plant around oaks can be grasses either seeded in the aisles or planted as container plants. There's a lot of flexibility in this layout with the drip lines in terms of the spacing that you can test out. So our typical layout would be 10 feet between plants along an irrigation row and 10 to 12 feet between irrigation rows. And then you, obviously not all of those are oaks. So we would, in a mix of, well, I can, this is a tile from the Central Valley, from along the Sacramento River, I think, but this would show kind of what we planted at this particular site around the oak. If you look at it, the yellow are valley oaks, and then there's elderberry and arroyo willow and Oregon ash in close. So those would be probably 10 feet apart in the layout. If this diagram isn't quite making sense to you, this would be an irrigation line running this direction, and then the next one over would be the second column.
Thank you very much. I hope that you can stick around. We have one more presenter before we just go to the panel discussion, and I'll invite more questions from the audience. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker, and he doesn't have any slides, or I don't think he has any slides.
Actually, I do.
Oh, you do? Okay. Well, if you want to share your screen while I introduce you, I'll get started. So our next speaker is Ryan West. He is the owner and president of Native West Nursery, which was formerly known as Recon Native Plant Nursery. Native West is a 30-acre plant nursery in San Diego County. It's within the city of San Diego that specializes in native plant production for habitat restoration and landscapes. And we are very fortunate to have this resource in Southern California. There's not very many of them, and we're so fortunate to have one so close. So over his 20-year career at Native West, Ryan has been involved in numerous large-scale habitat restoration projects and developed a restoration quality production protocol to improve plant hardiness and establishment success. Ryan grew up in San Diego and went to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. And Ryan will speak about acorn collection and processing at Native West's current process for oak propagation. I think I got that right. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan. Go ahead.
Thank you, Carolyn. Can you see my slides?
Yes, I can see them clearly.
I am a Zoom rookie other than happy hours with friends. So here we go. Just kind of give you an outline on what I'm going to talk about right now. Basically, an introduction about who we are and what we do down at Native West Nursery. Talk about acorn collection, acorn care and preparation, some of the different establishment options for establishing oaks on a restoration project, how we propagate our oaks, how we care for the seedlings, and then it looks like we'll go into a question and answer session after that. So this is going to be quick. It's just 8 slides. I think the meat will be answering questions afterwards. So Native West Nursery, we began operations in 2003. We were Recon Native Plants at the time. We were started by Recon Environmental to provide native plants for habitat restoration for the projects that they were installing. So the first really 10 to 12 years of us being a nursery was 100% focused on collecting seed and growing plants for habitat restoration. We're currently 30 acres. We have an additional 90-acre lease that I just picked up here in the Tijuana River Valley we're going to be using for seed farming. We are in, as I just mentioned, in the Tijuana River Valley, so very southern part of San Diego County. We grow plants for habitat restoration, and since that first 10 years, we've been growing a huge market right now in native plants in the landscape, largely for their wildlife attracting qualities and also drought tolerance. We do a lot of contract grows, but we also have a large on-hand inventory for kind of last-minute projects. We do seed collection. I have a full-time botanist who's out collecting seed. We get hired to collect seed on project sites, and we manage the seed internally, and then the seed's given back once the project is ready to receive it. We have been doing, and we're going to expand our seed increase operation. Now we have the additional farmland, so we will be able to provide, large-scale seed for restoration projects where necessary. And currently at about 50 full-time employees. So collection, that's really the first step of this for us. And what I'm going to speak to is what we do. I'm not really going to speak to what other people have been doing. This has been our process. It's worked well for us. It's adapted over the years, and this is our current process. Right now, when we go out and collect seed, we get permission to collect. We're generally on private land when we're collecting off of mature trees, and we're timing it. And the seed collection window is really kind of August to October, skewed towards September, October. Really depends on rainfall. But when we're out there getting ready to collect, we're looking for an acorn that is, they start off green, they expand, and once they're kind of done, you'll get a yellowing from the cap towards the tip of the acorn. And we generally say that once you start to see some yellowing to about 1/3 of the acorn, that's about ready to collect. And we're not picking up off the ground. We want to reduce any sort of insect infestation that might happen with the acorns. We want to have as much, for the effort, the acorns that are going to be viable and survive, germinate. So what we're doing is we're putting a tarp underneath the canopy of the tree. As large a tarp as you can get is better. And then just using a pole. There's some collapsible telescopic type poles that you can get for like pool sweeping nets, or also pruning poles, but without the pruner on the end. And all we're doing is just gently tapping the branches of the tree, trying to get the acorns that are ready to fall. We're not smacking them, trying to, dislodge anything that's green and isn't mature enough to actually fall off the tree. So that's generally really successful. You get a nice bunch of acorns on the tarp, gather it up, stick it into a bag, and bring it back to the nursery. An important part that Dan touched on in his talk is making sure that you're gathering data from each collection site. So we have as you can see in one of the slides there, this is actually the re-oak data sheet that we use with CMPS, or that the volunteer collectors were sending in. And so you're wanting to get the date of the collection, the location, GPS if possible, and now pretty much everybody's phones can get that information, which is great. The species, if possible. If not, generally when we're collecting internally, we know the species, so let's leave it there. The collector's name, and then any observations that you might see. So you could say the soil's really dry, this plant didn't look healthy, or this plant looked great, tons of acorns. Whatever observations you might see on site, we want to get those documented as well. Okay, so once we have collected the acorns, the first thing we want to do is bring them back and get them refrigerated. Once we refrigerate them, as many of you have worked with propagating oaks from acorns, there is a weevil, a filbert weevil, that is throughout California, and they lay eggs inside the acorn, and the larvae of the weevil turn into this grub, which you see on one of those pictures there, that eats the starch within the seed there. So that the beginning, they're small. The damage, depending on where the damage is, if it's at the actively growing tip, it will potentially kill the viability of that seed. But if it's somewhere else in the endosperm of that seed, you can still have viability in an acorn. So what we want to do is stop or slow that weevil as much as possible. So we get into the refrigerator, and that kind of chills them out, literally. Once we're ready to work with the acorns, we're going to take them out of cold storage. We're going to remove the caps, and we're going to put them in a 10% bleach solution. Just like put them in, swirl it around for a little bit, and then pull it out using like a colander or a screen. And then we'll rinse it with fresh water. A lot of people recommend pulling the floating acorns away and not utilizing those. We've actually done some tests and found that we're not seeing a huge difference between floating and sinking acorns in propagation. I think that you'll get a floating acorn if you get a little bit of gas. So maybe you have a little bit of that activity from that weevil larvae that's eaten a little bit of that endosperm, and so you have a little gas bubble in there, so they float. But if that damage again isn't on the meristem of where the root is going to initiate, you can still get a viable tree. So we don't remove the floaters. That's what we don't do. Rinse with fresh water. Take them, if you're not going to use them right away, we put them back in the refrigerator. So anytime where there's going to be a lapse in activity with the acorns, we want to keep them in the refrigerator. Okay, so now we have some nice clean refrigerated acorns, and for restoration projects you have really 3 options. I put 2 here, but the third one would be don't do anything and let the oaks try to establish themselves. We realize that that's not necessarily the most effective option. So the ones that we can affect would be to direct sow the acorns in ground, or to propagate containers for outplanting. As mentioned in previous talks, you get the root coming out of the acorn, it's growing down, assuming the conditions are right, that taproot is going to go down and find some water, and it's going to be the best option for establishment of the tree. And then if it does survive, generally the growth rate as well is going to be significantly faster than a plant that's planted from a container. That said, sometimes you don't have enough acorns to start with. There's quite a few species that have really modest seed set, or maybe have a bad year where you don't have a whole lot of seed. And so you want to give that limited amount of seed the best possibility for seedling establishment possible. And so you might want to grow those into a container in a nursery environment that is going to give it the ideal conditions for germination and establishment. Similarly, if you want to plant out of season, Chris, I believe, mentioned that the acorn seeds do not last very long, which is absolutely true. Big, moist endosperm inside that acorn that's going to dry out. And that's going to you're going to damage viability as time goes on, even in the refrigerator. So if you need to plant, say, from January to August, you see you have 3 months, say October, November, December, you have 3 months after you've collected the acorn that you can still use it, but you want to plant January, February, all the way through until August, you're not going to have any viable seed to be able to direct sow that seed. So you want to grow them into containers, grow them on, you get a nice, 6-inch to 1 foot little seedling that could be then outplanted. So those would be the two reasons why you'd want to propagate in a container. So what we do here for propagation, we have found that instead of sowing directly into containers, we prefer to germinate the acorn in the refrigerator in Ziploc bags or in flats under a mist type irrigation or irrigation where they're going to stay moist. Now, those aren't going to be in soil. They're just going to be sitting on the surface in flats. And once we see the tip of that acorn break and you see that white root radicle starting to emerge, that's our cue to take the acorn and put it into its own individual pot. And just for those who haven't done this before, the pointy end, all acorns have pointy ends, some more than others, but that's where the root is going to come out of. And that's also where the first cotyledonid is going to come out of. The first set of leaves are going to emerge from that pointy end. So we like to lay the acorn sideways, as you can see in that picture right there. We bury it about halfway. So half of this, that radius is buried, half of it isn't. And the radicle will continue to emerge and it'll turn its way down into the soil, establish those roots, and then the cotyledon will come up from that same point. Okay. Important in propagation, we are trying to keep any sort of pathogens out of the propagation process. So we use, in the entire process, from collection all the way through, especially after that bleach wash, we're using sterilized everything. So sterilized containers, sterilized soil, sterilized benches, bags, pans, whatever's touching the acorn or the container is sterilized. That's just to limit pathogens. Talk about kind of further down, but you also want to be growing, once you're under irrigation, growing them at least 3 feet off the ground. That's to limit any sort of splashing that may come off of nursery grounds or wherever you're growing them from the ground up onto the plants. We use containers. Now, there's a bit of, there's the holy grail of the taproot. When we're growing in a container, that's kind of out the window. We know we're not going to be able to maintain a viable taproot. We don't want the roots to circle. So we're kind of foregoing a taproot for healthy, fibrous roots in a container. We don't want them to circle again. So we are using a container that has lots of holes in the bottom and maybe a particular shape that's going to put the roots into a situation where they're getting air prone. So they're going out, they're hitting the air, that radical's dying, and then you're getting branching off of the roots and you're not getting circling. We want, additionally, benefit of that type of container and a container with a lot of holes is that you're getting really good drainage. And that's something that we found that's actually really important for oaks in containers. Is you want to have a soil that has a high porosity and you want to have a container that has a lot of drainage holes. That said, we want to keep the soil moist. We don't want to let it dry out. Oaks need to be moist when they're young. What we find if they dry out is you'll lose the apical meristem, that growing tip at the top of the tree will be the first thing to go. And then you get some weird branching action that isn't ideal for a long-term healthy tree once outplanted. So keep the soil moist, consistently moist. Now, a lot of people talk about mycorrhizae, and that mycorrhizae is great. In the nursery situation, not as important. Mycorrhizae in the wild helps plants they share nutrients and resources. In the container, the idea is that they have the resources they need. The additional thing that we know is that these plants are going to be going out into the wildlands. And at that point is when they're going to have their first interaction with mycorrhizae. And ideally, if the restoration practitioner is taking the next steps, they are bringing some leaf litter, some material from underneath an existing nearby stand of an oak woodland and helping to inoculate that site with some mycorrhizae. So not necessarily in a container, but as I say here, it also doesn't hurt. We start all of our acorns and seedlings in the shade once they're 4 to 6 inches tall, which really doesn't take long. These guys grow really fast. We can move them out into the full sun. If your site is maybe an established woodland and it's going to be pretty shady where you're planting, you don't necessarily need to move them into the full sun, although that also doesn't hurt. Having a plant that is hardened for whatever nature is going to throw at it is probably the best option. That's what we try to do here at the nursery, is have pretty rugged and hardy plants for restoration projects. So that's really the basics that I have. Wish everybody good luck with their efforts out there.
Thank you, Ryan. I'm going to start the questions with you. Some of them came up during the chat, if you don't mind. One person said, we have floated acorns overnight and there are a ton of weevil larvae floating dead the next day. Wondering if maybe this would help the end germination. Not sure what he means by that. By ensuring all the weevils are killed.
I think that once, you have to assume that you have weevils in the acorns. So the quicker that you can get this acorn processed and to a situation where it's germinating, the better. It sounds like, getting rid of the weevils or flooding them so that they are emerging themselves out of the acorn sounds great. Actually I might try that, see how it works out. We find that getting them in the refrigerator, slowing it down, and then getting them germinating. Once their roots initiating and it's kind of out of that acorn, you have cell division, it's away from the weevil, and you're good. So we want to get them germinating as quick as possible.
Thank you. If you can stop sharing your screen, and if Emma and Chris and Dan, if you guys can all unmute yourselves. I'm going to start with the first question, and I think it's for Dan, but if anyone else has anything to add to it, please feel free. Somebody asked how to identify locations of former oak groves that may have been removed over the years for firewood, etc. Maybe some GIS work has been done, ? Please share.
Well, I can go first just to say that I don't have a good answer. I think a lot of us a lot of us have seen oaks removed. And so, just within people that we can talk to, we know a lot. You can also see on some landscapes, if you drive down Highway 101 through San Luis Obispo, you just see incredibly beautiful oak forests, and then you see farm fields that are abandoned with oak saplings coming up. And that's millions of acres of fantastic oak country that will sequester a ton of carbon. So I feel like we've got millions of acres to work with that is just pretty obvious. That said, there hasn't been good mapping to my knowledge. I know that Janet Cobb and the California Oak Foundation have been trying to get the funding together to do comprehensive mapping of oaks in California. We don't even have really good GIS maps of current extent. And that's something really important that we need. The state needs to invest in that. Someone needs to invest in that, as we're literally planning what the future of California will look like and where we're going to put solar, which lands are for water, for watersheds, for sequestration. We need maps of the really high priority biodiversity sites in places like oaks. So just to put that plug in there.
Does anybody else want to say anything to that? I'll just say that, there is the option of reviewing historical GIS photographs, although that's pretty time intensive to go down to your local county or records office and pour through those documents. But if there's historical aerial photographs, which there are for a lot of areas of California, you can do it. It just takes time. But go ahead, Chris. I'm sorry. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, so the historic aerials generally are like the late 30s or so, 1930s, and into the 40s. So that can help get some of that. And then the other pieces to use are some of the old, and sometimes they're easy to find and sometimes they're really hard to find, like some of the Hispanic colonizers, when they kept some of their diaries, some of the mission records might have things like that. So there are some kind of historic European settlement, post-European settlement of some of the areas that have that had a lot of oaks around them that are just now gone because they chewed up all the wood for whatever reasons or not. And so that can get you into the, in some cases into the 1800s, but it's super site specific. Because, it might be, you might have one valley that had, a historic ranch or something in it, and there was a record of that area being, having a lot of oaks, and the next valley over, there hasn't been that much record. But yeah, it's really tough going back farther than that, unless there's some sort of archaeological evidence, like grinding holes, metates, in an area where there are no oaks around.
Yeah, and somebody just dropped in the chat, historicaerials.com. So there's that resource as well. The next question for Chris, or anyone really, somebody asked in the chat, chicken wire rusts out. So if you use chicken wire to protect a young oak and it rusts out, then presumably you wouldn't have to go back and remove it.
Chicken wire, yes, it rusts out. It does not prevent small gophers. So you need to use something like 1/4-inch hardware cloth, that kind of gridded meshed wire cloth, which doesn't rust as fast and is a lot harder to pull out, which is why you got to kind of make a big wide circle of it so you don't damage those oak roots when you get it out. But yeah, gophers are definitely a pain with oak seedlings.
Okay. Another question, maybe Ryan or Emma could answer this one. When is the best time to prune oak trees?
I would recommend against it if possible. But if you do need to prune, I would prune when they're dormant. So probably in the summer, I don't know, maybe in the summertime when they're not actively growing.
More like if you had to prune them in a landscape situation, if it's, especially if it's too close to a house or a structure, I would assume. But yes, out in the wild, if it's growing like on a habitat restoration project, you shouldn't touch it if you don't have to.
The best time is probably prune it shortly before you want it to die. But I think most important on pruning is to really prune way back from the trunk. And you see licensed arborists cutting right against the trunk. So it looks like there was never a branch there. And that's a great way to destroy your heritage tree, because rock gets in and it takes out the core of the tree. You want to prune the thing back so it's got an ugly stub of a branch, which then can heal and protect the heartwood of the mother tree from that rot. So.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, Dan, I think you're kind of getting in the idea of you want to prune the smallest branch that will make somewhat of a difference in the shape of a tree.
Yeah.
So you're targeting the smallest branch possible. And ideally you're targeting the branches when the oak is really, really small. So you're only pruning, branches that are less than 1/4 inch and working through the life of the tree. But some of us deal with, historic old trees.
Does anybody from the audience want to go ahead and unmute themselves and ask a question? You have the power to unmute.
I do have a question for Dan. Dan, just a clarification, because I think you were discouraging, or you were depicting hybrids as a negative thing. And I just wanted to, if you can give us some more insight of what you meant by saying that we want to avoid hybrids. You're muted, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So certainly in oaks, you cannot avoid hybrids. That's the rule of oaks, the beauty of oaks. What I do want to avoid is humans getting squirrely and changing natural patterns of population genetics, and doing our own hybridizing, and especially to the point where people talk about engineering plants, engineering neonatives, or selecting ones that are likely to be climate change resistant, whatever that means. And then moving, for example, oaks from Stanislaus up into Marin County because, because some grad student put together a climate model and another one used Maxent at its default settings and concluded that they're going to be extinct under some hypothetical future. I think that these plants have been here for a very long time. During great epochs of climate change, during the Holocene, when climate has gone like this. And I think they have mysteries, they have solutions buried within them that we cannot fathom and that we will want to have access to in the future, in decades and centuries and millennia to come. The solutions that they have coded into their DNA and other organelle stuff are the most valuable resources on the planet. And I think that we don't understand well enough now to be able to predict things, much less engineer things. And when we do, we cause great harm. And so obviously there is a likelihood that in the future, in decades or in a century, things are going to get really bad. And we may need to take some kind of crazy actions. But I follow the philosophy of, first do no harm. And we are definitely at the first point. These secrets that we need to learn, we're only just learning the alphabet of them. And I feel like we have time to exercise technology in really ambitious ways. And with oaks, it's a little bit less important because they naturally hybridize like crazy, and they have very large scale. Like a gene shed for an oak might be many kilometers instead of a few hundred feet, as it is for many plants. And yet even then I think of things like Victoria Stork's work in I think like 2002 or something like that, in which they went out across California, collected oak material, sequenced it, and looked at they looked at the genetic structure of these plants, and they were able to reconstruct the movement of oaks from one part of California across the valley into another part of California as climate changed in the past. And if we start moving things around in really ambitious ways where, hey, I just got my degree and now I'm a land manager and I wanna mix it up. All you need is a few hundred humans doing that for a few decades, and we've lost our ability to understand what's happened in the past. And right now, I think the most important thing for us is to listen, to pay attention, to try and learn from these things, to try and understand what happened, how climate changed, and how did oaks respond to that. I think we need to be observers at this time and not engineers. And I can, in particular, just in closing, we have examples of losing beautiful things by moving them around and loving them too much. Texas lost their state flower by collecting seeds of Lupinus texanum, growing millions of pounds of it and spreading them around Texas. That was before they realized that it was actually a species complex. It was a number of species. Now it is a monomictic population of a generic astroturf plant that is grown in Nebraska. We've lost sycamores through a similar process. Christina Schoenbeck did a terribly sad and beautiful and well-done paper looking at it's essentially impossible to find wild sycamores anymore. They're Turkish sycamores in California. And as a biodiversity hotspot with more plants than any other state and more rare plants than most states have plants, we have a lot to lose. And so I'm very cautious about that.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. If I may, Caroline, I would like just to. My question was actually to highlight the importance of hybrids in the system, right? And the nature of this system is beautifully, it has evolved through hybridization in a lot of these species. So for me, it's like I'm not making hybrids as the demon, but actually that natural process. But I'm with you. Like I respect your opinion, and thanks for
yeah. I mean, the beautiful thing with oaks is that there's just such beautiful patterns out there that if you can look at their DNA, there's so many cool stories about what happened. And hybridization as a function of climate change, and hybridization as a function of humans carrying beautiful acorns around the landscape for thousands of years. And it would just be such a tragedy for us to lose all of that, lose our ability to see those stories because we stepped in this crazy decade and just did our own hybrids. And there are people talking about that. I'm sure you've heard them.
Let's go ahead and see if anyone else from the audience wants to unmute themselves and ask a question.
I do. I want to ask a question about lateral roots. If I were to plant an oak in my yard, how wide will the lateral roots go in 50 years?
Anybody? Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, I could take that just on a basic knowledge that I have of generally, they say that the roots extend to about the canopy. So if you have a large canopy in 50 years, your roots are going to go out about that far. Now, I'm not sure that's actually true, but that's what I've heard.
I'm going to give the it depends answer. It depends on your site, soil type, slope, how close you are to bedrock. I mean, in some cases, I've seen two times the canopy out, but it can also be closer and probably even farther. Although once you're starting to get out like 3 times the canopy, it's really hard to kind of figure out whether that root you have is from one tree over there or one tree over there. But yeah, a good rule is 1x of the canopy. So the canopy drip line plus just a tiny little bit, but then even more in some cases.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to unmute themselves and ask some questions?
When it comes to
I'm sorry, Dan.
pruning the trees, could you also coppice them down to the ground to promote new growth if there's a lot of dead growth? We have a lot of like multi-trunked oak trees, and there's like 2 or 3 of the 4 that are on the tree are dying or dead. And I'm just wondering if we were to cut the thing all the way down to let it grow again, would that be beneficial, or would it be best to cut just the dead trunks out of the system to let the energy go to the healthy trunk?
Corey, do you want to tell us where you're located? Is this?
I'm in Julian, California.
And is this your private property or is
this?
Okay. And do you think there's like evidence of any of the pests or things like that?
Yeah, it's probably the beetle borer.
I'm going to go ahead. Does anybody want to unmute themselves and answer that question?
Is Mike Puzo on this?
I don't think he is, but I gave Corey his email address. But Mike, are you on here? I searched the participants. I didn't see him.
Okay. So Mike Puzo with California State Parks is doing exactly what you're talking about, specifically for GSOB damage. And so if you have a large tree that is dying of GSOB, and they're currently in the research phase of this, they haven't quite gotten far along with this. But basically, if the tree is still healthy but is slowly dying of GSOB, you can coppice it, and you'll get the resprouting. You have to coppice it correctly, of course. And so you can talk to him or an arborist about coppicing it correctly, so you get the new sprouts coming out rather from the old stump, but more closer to the roots, around the root collar. And it will buy time to stop or slow down GSOB from basically killing the resprouts, because GSOB really favors big older trees. So, it's say you're kind of cutting the tree down to stop it from dying, to then save it by letting those coppice resprouts come up. So his preliminary research shows that it does work, The, of course, long-term issue is once those coppices get to be tree-sized again, they're going to be infested with GSOB again, unless we get rid of GSOB. So you're buying time, absolutely, which is a great thing to do, but it doesn't solve the whole problem.
Does anyone else want to unmute themselves and ask a question? Go right ahead.
Okay, I'll ask a geological question. Is there a soil series that oaks prefer, or are there rock types, the granitic rocks or the metamorphic rocks or the sedimentary or the volcanic rocks that have more oaks or more of a particular species?
Okay, I think you stumped the panelists, Nori. There's an award.
I don't see patterns in the field very well, but I'm not really like checking to see what rock types I'm on and how many oaks are there. And then we've kind of mucked up some of the oaks so bad that it's hard to tell if this one patch over here, which is more in kind of a limestone area, is doing great because it's on a limestone or whatever, or granitic, or it just happened to get not chopped down by somebody 100 years ago.
Dan, you want to go ahead? Did you want to say something?
Yeah, well, I think it's, I think there probably are, that's a big question with, that you could have a series of graduate courses on, or a lifetime of research. I think there are some clear associations, especially with some shrub oaks. You've got some shrub oaks that are, very strongly associated with serpentine soils. And you've got things like valley oaks, which are very strongly associated with just the deepest, richest soils that we have, and so have been really targeted for removal. You've got a lot of associations, but I don't think they're as tightly, with the exceptions of shrub oaks and things like that that associate with serpentine. I think the associations aren't as tight. You're going to have preferences and stuff like that, but you're probably, you got oaks everywhere in California, except for on, highly alkali soils or where it's just too dry for them. But we're blessed.
Thanks, Dan. I'm going to ask a question. Chris, you mentioned in your talk, you were talking about like using the T-post and because of the cows. And I don't know if I don't want to necessarily have you put your slides back up, but it just wasn't real clear to me where the T-post is with the protector that's around the oak to keep the cow from running it over. And was the T-post there so the cow can like rub up against it and scratch himself?
Well, I guess the best thing you should do is, if you have cows on your site, is put out a whole bunch of dummy T-posts around your oak grove. And then the cows will bend over the very low importance T-posts. So, like if that was, that would be the way I would do it, is kind of set out those traps around it of T-posts just there without anything. But the T-post goes, you have plant in the ground, and then you have the T-post right near it. And then the tree protector is kind of attached to the T-post. So, I mean, most people use like rebar or a plastic stake or something like that. But if you have cows, then they, like I said, they kind of get itchy and they're a little bit curious. So they see this kind of tall thing that's just about cow sized, and they want to like scratch their belly, and then they bend over a T-post. And having straightened several T-posts in my lifetime, they're a lot stronger than I am. So yeah, there's that. Cows can mess up restoration sites relatively quickly. They're smarter than we give them credit for.
Thank you, Chris. And Ryan, I wanted to ask you, you were talking about in your presentation about a method for preventing the roots from circling in the pot. And so you use pots with many holes, or I'm not exactly sure. I didn't have a chance to write it all down. I was wondering if you could just sort of review that part of it.
I didn't just run away. I don't know if we can get this in focus. But it's a pot that has a strange kind of shape to it. There's the top.
Oh, I see it now. Yeah. Okay.
And then all the roots are kind of directed down into these little angles, where at the bottom of the angles there's holes, and you know, the roots hit the air and then they prune, and so you avoid circling. Now there's also cone-shaped containers that we will take a kind of a hot bar and we'll melt off the bottom where it comes to a taper at the bottom, and we'll just open up the holes so that we get a nice big opening so that they're getting air pruned. They're all kind of being directed towards the center and then hitting the air. So you don't need a special one like this. This is called a root maker pot. But you can do it with really any pot where you just remove the bottom.
Ryan, I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
What's your opinion on tall pots like D60s or D40s or tree pots?
When irrigation may not be consistent on a site and you want to have a nice deep, you know, get the roots as deep as possible before your crew or whoever's planting leaves, it's valuable. They're quite a bit slower to plant. But you're still not gonna save the taproot. Now, if you have a plant that's in a D60 and what's that, like 18 inches tall or so, it's the plant itself to get established into that D60 is also going to be pretty tall. So by the time it fills out that D60 container, you've already lost the taproot as well. So for me, those deep pots are more for moisture management in the planting site.
It's a lot of soil too. It's expensive to fill those things. And then, you know, one caution is you want to get things out of the greenhouse as soon as possible to avoid infection with Phytophthora in particular. Mm-hmm. And it's nice to plant small plants. I want to say hi, Ryan. I haven't seen you in a couple of years, but I got to tell you, it was really great working with Ryan. He was conscientious about all this stuff. Very good about Phytophthora prevention practices. You know, when I got another project, I'm going to Ryan West.
Thank you, Dan. Good to see you as well.
Hey, let me ask a question to everybody. I know I've worked with you know, some of you in the past, especially Emma, and funding is always an issue, especially for these larger scale projects. So if anybody has any good funding ideas, they can throw out to some of us out here watching.
Yeah, well, Kurt, I think you know about One Tree Planted. They're a great operation, fun folks out of the East Coast. They've got an interesting model. So they basically are looking for projects where they can give you $1 per tree that you plant, which doesn't work as well for oaks. They're a little bit more expensive. But you know, folks can know about them, and there's some flexibility. And then there's a lot of state funding that should be hitting the dirt over the next 2 years. And I see Emma nodding, and Emma, you're definitely hooked up in that world a lot. And I don't know if the urban tree planting stuff has come through yet, but that was a $400 million request just for our urban areas. And then obviously we've got 3.7 billion still being negotiated, of which some of it will go to tree planting. So I think, and especially if you're working on tribal lands or working with tribes, I think there's a lot of interest in really, you know, making up for lack of investment in the past. I think we're in a great chance to pull stuff together.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with all of that. I think there's a lot coming down the pipeline from the Wildlife Conservation Board or CDFW. We'll have to see where these things come from, but funding for wildlife corridors that could be oak, riparian woodlands, riparian woodland priorities in all kinds of funding programs coming up.
Yeah, and there was a comment in the chat. I encourage everyone to reach out to their local NRCS field offices as well.
Yeah.
And a couple of, Connor just posted another one with the another one that has grants as well. Kurt, there was a question, if you're still on, about if they can get, someone wants copies of some of the slides. Probably, I mean, I'm guessing, especially the ones from today. I think Ryan's slides and some of Chris's slides on sort of like the how-tos and the nitty-gritties, if those are going to be posted.
Yeah, well, I'll just answer. In the past, I've collected slides, but a lot of times people don't, I always have files and files of slides, but if you want to reach out directly to me, I'll get you in touch with whoever you're interested in their slides. And I'm sure most of our speakers are happy to provide them or get you the sources, or reach out directly if they provided the info. But those slides can be available, and I'm definitely recording this, so that will be available.
I'm just being silent in case there is somebody else that wants to unmute themselves and ask a question directly.
While someone's working to unmute, just as a follow-up on the funding question, I was a little bit vague. There's a lot of money. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, and that's from like, a few million to 100 million. So it's not just a lot of money, but the ramp up is incredible. It's going to be hard to move it, and folks are going to be challenged. And I don't know, like Emma said, we don't even know what agency it's going to be coming out of. And so it's tough to give a good answer, but you have people working for you who can give you a good answer. Your assembly members and your state senator, that's their job. And so they're very happy to hear from you. And their staff are very good at tracking that information down. And so I would suggest that you call Tony Atkins' office, that you call Bob Wajkowski's office, that you send an email to the staff. They'll respond quickly, and they'll find an answer that none of us are able to give. And in the process of that, they will understand that this is important to you. And they may want to come out for a tree planting or something like that. But that's how we get big funding for important stuff like that, is for them to know that they've got constituents looking for it. So that's the best place to get an answer, and then you're going to be doing good just by reaching out to them.
Thanks, Dan.
Carolyn, a question just popped up in the chat. I don't know if you saw it. Oak woodland areas that have been overgrazed for many, many years, is re-oaking more of a challenge?
I would say if it's an oak woodland that's intact, even if it's been overgrazed, there may be some work that's needed to rehabilitate it, but I don't think planting oaks is necessarily the thing. If you mean a site which was formerly an oak woodland and then it was a row crop field for 40 years and now it's reverting back, I think those are actually probably not challenges, because the kind of technologies that Emma's been using, they've done incredible work pioneering agronomic restoration techniques. So if you have a site that really doesn't have a lot of resources, doesn't have a lot of biodiversity resources, and you can manipulate it as an ag field, you can make great progress. Looking at that 4-year-old tree of yours, oh my God. It's more challenging when you're trying to, as we are in most of California, where you're working around something that's important, and you have to kind of tiptoe and not break the thing that you're trying to protect, and yet try and restore a site that still is intact, and that's challenging.
Emma, did you want to say anything about that?
I'll just agree again with Dan. I agree 100%. Yeah, we've worked in a number of areas that have been grazed for a long time, and if that means that there's not much intact vegetation, then there's a lot we can do. If there is still some vegetation to work around, there's some challenges with that, but can still happen.
Emma, I wonder, there was some talk about nurse plants and planting associated with oaks. Your design looks really cool. Are you specifically hoping to get data that will let you see kind of, planting combos and benefits or costs?
I would love to do that, and we're set up for it really well. It's something that the challenge for us would be getting that data analyzed and reporting out on results. So we're pretty focused on the groundwork, and we have a harder time getting the time and the money to report out on those, unfortunately. But I think it's a great idea, and the setup is perfect for that sort of question.
And Emma, there's a question in the chat for you. What is the mortality rate of your method? I don't know if you answered that.
Yeah, we find our goal is somewhere in the 70 to 80% survivorship. So, and that's usually very achievable for oaks in particular.
Thank you.
If people are local and they'd like to see a restoration site in San Diego County, I'll put my email in the chat again in case you missed it on the slides, and I'm happy to take people out and take a look in person.
Thank you.
I'll add that I'm not saying anything wrong about Emma and Dan's methods. I'm usually out in areas that are not flat, they're hilly, they're rocky, they're weedy. They're definitely great oak habitat, but they're also, in many cases really weedy or overburned. So they're, filled with annual grasses and mustards. And there's, hardly any native plants around. I'll have aerial photographs that will show that, there were a lot more oaks nearby than there currently are. And those areas definitely are difficult to restore. But a lot of that is just keeping the weeds away, keeping wildfires away in that critical first year or two when the seedlings are established, keeping them wet or mulched, or keeping some sort of, animals away from herbivores. So nothing against what Emma's doing on flat areas that you can tow a tractor on, because that would be amazing to do things like that on some of the hills that I'm out in or the canyons. So there's definitely a spectrum of sites that we're restoring on. And I'd say, yeah, there's definitely sites that are really easy, or not really easy, relatively speaking, which is still not easy. But then there's sites that are just, they're likely to burn in the next 5 years because there's a freeway nearby and there's a lot of cars that are shooting off sparks every year, or, 4th of July or whatever. So it can be a challenge on some sites, and on some sites it can be nice, and you can get forests like Emma has within, 5 years. And it's amazing.
I'm going to turn it back over to Kurt. Please take a moment to take the survey. I've dropped it in the chat a number of times, but thank you to our speakers. Thank you for taking the time, and thank you to everyone for attending. Or not, I'm not releasing you yet though. I think Kurt wants to say goodbye.
Yeah, let me do the closing. Thanks to our afternoon speakers. I think this has been, we tried to balance it out so that we kind of had the, the negative morning, the positive afternoon, but really, it kind of ebbs and flows and closes with this great, let's get some restoration done. Let's, even if it just means planting a tree in the backyard, that's something positive we can all do. It's the, what's the saying, the best time to plant a tree is now, the second best time is, 20 years ago or whatever. So we're still doing something positive. We're helping the planet. Thank you to UCCE, Climate Science Alliance, for helping me put this on. And anybody is willing, anybody who's in this can reach out to me directly, and I can get you in touch with people if you don't have contact. As long as those people want to talk to you, I'll get you in touch, and you can reach out to me. You can reach out to Chris, Carolyn, Anna, or Connor from the Climate Science Alliance to help me set this up. And I guess that's it. I'll keep it on for a couple seconds. If anybody has any last follow-up questions, I'll leave the stream going for a few minutes, and if anybody wants to check the chat for some of the links and things. So thank you, everybody. It's been great.
Thank you, Kurt.